Hello, I'm here. How is everyone doing? How are you, Chris? And hello, Dr. Bowen. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, thanks, Elizabeth. It's nice to be here with you guys.
Oh, that's wonderful. All right. So, Chris, did I hear you wanted to go ahead and get started? Because I'm ready for that.
Yep. No, I think we should start. We got a lot of people in here, and I'm sure more people will be straggling in.
Okay, perfect. All right. Well, thank you everyone for tonight, for joining tonight's Philosophy in the Spotlight. So today we are very honored to have Dr. Amber Bowen here from Redeemer University to talk to us and with us about Kierkegaard and also specifically Fear and Trembling. So what we do here is basically for the first half of the hour, my co-host Christopher Satoor and I will be kind of asking and interviewing our guest, Dr. Bowen, and then we will, for the next half of the hour, we'll turn it over to everyone. And so be ready with your questions and your thoughts. We'd love to hear from all of you. So thanks. So I'll go ahead and introduce Dr. Amber Bowen. So she is an associate professor of core studies and philosophy at Redeemer University in Ontario, Canada. She has her Bachelor of Arts in History and a Master of Arts in Philosophy of Religion from Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, of which I think her thesis has a really interesting title, Myths of Reason and Idols of Faith, a Kierkegaardian dialogue with evangelical apologetics, which I might have to ask her about that because that sounds really fascinating. Dr. Bowen obtained her PhD in philosophy in 2021 from Trinity College at University of Aberdeen, where she published her dissertation, Hearing, Doing, Becoming, a Kierkegaardian Phenomenology of the Self. So thank you again, Dr. Bowen, for being with us. Anything else that you want to tell us about yourself? We would love to hear that. And then also if you just want to share with us why you find Kierkegaard's works and ideas so compelling.
Oh, thank you, Elizabeth, for that kind introduction. First of all, I really love what you guys are doing with these spaces and creating these very collaborative and charitable and hospitable environments for just conversation and thinking together and a free flow of ideas. And so I've appreciated tuning in at different points, and I'm excited for all the new things that you guys have rolling out. It's really exciting. So,
thanks.
Yeah, so I started, I'll say this, I read Kierkegaard for the first time when I was in undergrad, and I did a Great Books program at just a small liberal arts college. And a Great Books program is just essentially where we were reading primary texts throughout the history of Western philosophy. And of course, Kierkegaard has a presence there. And so we read Fear and Trembling, actually. And I remember that the professor really talked about how, look, Kierkegaard, he's, first of all, what a terrible exegesis of Genesis 22, and has even read the text, and he's clearly just playing around here, and he's talking about faith as this radically irrational thing, and really just kind of set Kierkegaard up as the whipping boy for lots of different conversations. And so I came away from that, and the text was very hard and very confusing, and I was young, and I was like, okay. But then years later, I somehow, just random circumstances, decided I actually wanted to look back into this Soren Kierkegaard guy. And I was doing my master's in philosophy of religion, which was an analytic philosophy program. And I pulled a couple of secondary sources, which I would say are actually very helpful when you're entering into Kierkegaard's authorship for the first time, because it is so truly unique and different that sometimes it helps to have some categories to like bins to put things in while you're reading. So I read C. Stephen Evans' Introduction to Kierkegaard, and I read Merold Westphal's Kierkegaard's Concept of Faith, or Understanding of Faith, one of the two. And those books really helped me. And then I picked up Fear and Trembling again because I wanted to revisit it after having gotten a little bit of a sense of orientation. And I had the most incredible experience with this text. I mean, usually whenever, I would say this is still the case for me now, I read a Kierkegaardian text and I am just banging my head on it. Like, I feel like this is not necessarily anything interesting. I feel like he's talking in circles. I don't get it. Why is this important? Is he just playing around? You know? And I give it a second read and I'm like, okay, I'm starting to have some more questions here. Haven't figured this out, but I'm starting to formulate questions. Third read, fourth read, fifth read. He's just that thinker that you just kind of have to keep rereading. And about like my fourth read through Fear and Trembling back then, I was so overwhelmed on just a personal level. I had this realization, this sort of personal moment of, oh my goodness, I am the Knight of Infinite Resignation. Like, this is me. This is what I think. And I do think that this is being pious, or I do think that this is being spiritual, or I do have this kind of, that his description does fit the nature of my relationship with God right now. And I just saw myself in the text so much. But at the same time, as it was like convicting, it was also super encouraging. And so I remember thinking that I was about to start my PhD work, and this thinker had fascinated me. He had given me a lot of ways of thinking about things that I really wanted to pursue. But I had never in my life experienced reading a philosopher that had been so personally edifying to me. And I just thought, if I'm going to be studying a particular thinker for the next at least 3 years for my doctoral program, maybe even the rest of my life, I want it to be somebody who has that kind of an impact on me. And I would say that I have found that to be true. Even this past week, I read a discourse of his that I had never actually read before on the occasion of a confession, had that exact same experience of just the process of reading and rereading, and then coming to that point of, wow, now I'm not even thinking about this text anymore. I'm having to go for a walk and think about my life. And I just think that is, yes, philosophy is rigorous. We present ideas, we present arguments, we challenge each other, we offer new things, we construct new things. But at the end of the day, if we're not becoming better people, then what is it all for? And I think that's what Kierkegaard really leaves us with.
That's so amazing. I really appreciate your sharing. I think it's so relieving and just, wonderful to hear that other established scholars and academics can struggle with their first or second reading of a textbook, and it just is really encouraging to not give up. And I'm sure that you teach, you help your students approach Kierkegaard and Fear and Trembling in quite a different way than your first professor did.
Yeah, well, I really enjoy kind of exonerating him sometimes, because I think some people come in, depending on their background and what they've heard about him, sometimes they come in a bit on the defensive. I would say, especially if they come from more of a Christian evangelical background, that would be the case. Or they might not have ever heard of this guy before. And so but I find that regardless, he stages a conversation about faith and what it is, and in such a unique way that it kind of doesn't matter where you are on a spiritual journey, or even if you even have a kind of confessional faith at all. It's so interesting, no matter where you're coming from.
So I have kind of an odd question, but I don't know how you'll take it. But for me, when I read this text for the first time and I knew a little bit about Kierkegaard, I always thought that Isaac represented, Johannes Silencio, the silent voice of Kierkegaard, because there's that revelation that his father had up on the hillock where he cursed the name of God, and then he felt that he was cursed, and a lot of his children had passed away from this time, and Kierkegaard felt this great anxiety and dread, and he talks about this anxiety in the actual text. So do you think there's a little bit of maybe a kind of, let's say, a kind of translucent biography in the text, or do you think it's primarily, do you think his voice is at all, like the real Kierkegaard's voice is at all in this text, or is there more going on? I was just wondering that.
Yeah, it's a great question, and this is one of those questions that scholars chase and all day long is, what do we think about the actual historical figure and the actual historical author versus all these like crazy things that he's doing with these pseudonyms? It's this infinite jest thing. You'll never be able to find the real Kierkegaard. There isn't even a real Kierkegaard, even that's a pseudonym. All questions about biography and the form of his work. They're never ending, and it's part of what makes him so interesting. I haven't ever heard or thought or seen kind of a mapping between, I haven't thought of this before, a mapping between his own father and him, and that father-son experience. Obviously we always carry things with us when we write things. The biographical piece that's more commonly mapped onto this story or this text has to do with his ex-fiancée, Regina Olsen. And he says in his diaries, in his journals, that if he had faith, he would have stayed with Regina. He would not have broken up with her, ended that engagement. So there seems to be a sense in which he's at least alluding to this, right? And who knows? But he's at least alluding to the idea that he maybe gave her up as his Isaac, if you will, in this act of resignation or faith, maybe in some way thinking that God would give her back to him. But then he made the mistake in realizing that faith wasn't just like resigning to something, it's also re-embracing in a different mode after you've resigned to it. And so it's almost like he had this immature kind of, according to his own thought, giving away of his love. And then he looked back later and said, no, that wasn't actual faith. Actual faith would have been to embrace her in a different way as a gift and to have married her.
Thank you for that. That was very profound.
Wow, that is so interesting because, I think that when, and I am kind of going through this text for my second time, and I think the first time that I read it, I felt that there was such, like, the individual was really emphasized to me, and sort of like this sort of hero of faith, striking out on his own, not telling his wife, not telling really anyone that he was going on this journey. But I really see it in your response, and maybe in your dissertation you focused on this as well. Do you see in this text Kierkegaard highlighting the relational self as a particularly important kind of self? And and what kind of treatment did you give fear and trembling in your dissertation? What does maybe hearing, doing, and becoming have to do with the relational self?
Such a great question. So there's kind of almost three different parts of a response that I'd like to give to that. One is that I do think that the Kierkegaardian self is a deeply relational self. And that's one of the sort of caricatures that you have of Kierkegaard, is that he's this radical individualist, almost like a solipsist, emphasizing the single individual so much that it's this radical autonomy. And I actually think that it's hard to spend very much time. I could see that if you just read Fear and Trembling, you might come away with that. But when you think about the authorship as a whole, and you think about other key philosophical concepts that are sort of like hangers that you see repeated throughout his authorship, you don't see a radically autonomous, isolated self. You see a deeply relational self, bi-directionally relational with both God and with others. So my PhD supervisor, J. Aaron Simmons, he calls it bi-directional relationality where it's mutually constitutive of the self. And so I think when it comes to fear and trembling, though, there's this question of, okay, what about this radical individual that he's talking about in Abraham, as you said, Elisabeth, who doesn't say anything to Sarah? He just, gets up, and the silence emphasized, right? And two things that I think are helpful to think about is, one, I actually read Kierkegaard as a proto-phenomenologist. And so obviously phenomenology began in a more formal sense. The method took on a more formal form, if you will, with more specific rules and tools that are articulated in certain ways later, beginning especially with Edmund Husserl. But that kind of phenomenological way of thinking was already in the water long before Husserl. And I actually think that phenomenology gives us words and tools that we can use to go back and actually see what Kierkegaard was doing, even though he wasn't operating on that same kind of formal phenomenological register. And so that being the case, even in a text like Works of Love, or on the occasion of a wedding, or on the occasion of a confession, or any of these, he's really offering a kind of phenomenological analysis. He's giving descriptions of certain experiences as phenomena present themselves to consciousness, and what is that like? And so I think what is easy for us to interpret as a radical individualism is actually just a phenomenological analysis of phenomena as they are appearing to consciousness. So I think that's one part of that answer, and why I think he's not this radical individualist. Secondly, I think when it comes to fear and trembling, it's important to keep history of philosophy in mind when reading this text, because this is not an isolated text. This is a text that is very, very deeply in conversation with both Kant and Hegel. And this is Chris's wheelhouse for sure. So I'm really interested in hearing your thoughts on this, Chris. But really what Silentio is doing is he is offering a massive critique of both Kantian and Hegelian ethics in their different ways of understanding the universal. And what he's saying is that Abraham is a problem for both of them, that neither one can actually solve the Abraham problem. And so what he's wanting to do, especially in the case with Hegel, is to show that faith is not this thing that can be just absorbed into the social order. It's not that philosophy can make faith sort of less primitive and more rational and figure out how to make it a better version of itself and kind of absorb it into itself. He's saying you don't know what to do with Abraham if that's the case in this story in Scripture. And so he is wanting to pull the single individual out from being collapsed into the social order. But that doesn't mean he's advocating a kind of anthropology of radical autonomous individualism. It means instead, I usually say, and instead of single individual, because that term can be kind of fraught for us, instead to think about a singular subject. It's me as myself before God. And so there's a sense in which when I stand before God, I stand before God as myself, not as someone else, but I have a kind of responsibility for the subject that I am and the selfhood that has been given to me. And so this doesn't mean that I'm not constituted in very radical ways by the relationships around me and my relationship with God. It just means that what he's wanting to emphasize as sort of a corrective to the philosophies of his day is that we cannot lose that singular, unique, irreplaceable subject by thinking that you could just take on a social role and therefore you have fulfilled any kind of spiritual obligation or have come to live out faith in a meaningful way. Yeah,
I was gonna say that I mean, he has a distinction about Christendom, right? Christendom is that realm of the marketplace. It's the agora of ideas, and and I can see him challenging Kant in the sense that, you know, the individual, yes, they can be sovereign, they can be self-determined, but there's something more than just the categorical imperative, you know, seeing people as ends in themselves. And I wanted to ask you something just before we continued. What really struck me about this text, and I reread it again today, is this absurdity, the kind of impossibility of all possibilities, this moment of the absurd leap. What's so interesting is that, in a sense, Abraham, from Kierkegaard's perspective, would fail both Kantian and Hegelian ethics, in the sense that Isaac's going to be sacrificed, thou shalt not kill, and also, you know, there's the commandment of honoring God and obeying. So there's this paradox where paradoxa, the two voices of this decision, leads Abraham to go higher and further into this moment of the absurd. And I was kind of just, I don't know why, I was wondering if you could elaborate on maybe what is the night of what is the individual of infinite resignation, and what is the night of faith?
Yeah, you're definitely right, Chris, in this emphasis on the absurd and kind of going beyond, because Abraham can't fit within Hegelian or Kantian ethics. And so he pushes on this notion of the absurd, and the night of resignation, and especially the night of faith, are examples of this. But to offer another clarification for to maybe bust another myth that's commonly associated with Kierkegaard, is that he's this irrationalist or this fideist who thinks that faith by definition must be irrational. And I don't think that that's actually correct. I think he's trying to do something a lot more nuanced there, and thinking about Hegel and Kant is really helpful in understanding this, because what he's trying to say is that for both Hegel and Kant, who claim to situate their ethics on universality, to have found the highest, whether the categorical imperative or the social order, what have you, that there is nothing higher than it. What he says is those systems are actually latently secular, because essentially you have to encapsulate God internal to reason. And so, but he doesn't want to do that. He thinks that's, you know, the God of the philosophers, and you don't have a living God of living faith. And so what he wants to think about, though, is what does it mean to break out of what Climacus, another pseudonymous author, calls Socratic thinking, which is essentially the kind of thinking that is possible internal to a finite human horizon. What are the concepts and different kinds of understandings that we can have just on the powers of human reason itself? And what is the range of possibilities that's available to us internal to that finite human horizon? And what he wants to say is, at a certain point, you come to the limits, because that is a finite horizon. But you only come to your limits, you only know that you've reached your limit when something else from the outside has encountered you, when something from beyond has come. And so it's sort of like in Philosophical Fragments, a great analogy for what Climacus is talking about, that's very similar to Fear and Trembling, is the King Midas's touch, the story of King Midas turning his entire palace into gold, right? But everything he touches, and this seemed to be like a dream. Like, look, I'm turning my entire world into gold. This is fantastic. But then, of course, he realizes this is not so great when he tries to pick up food, or especially when he goes and his daughter comes to him and he hugs her. So, and then she turns to gold as well. So he finds that he's actually imprisoned in this prison of gold, and he can't get outside of it. And that for Climacus is sort of what human reason is like. We can't think the unknown. Anytime we do, we make it the known. And so in order to find the edges or the limits of our human understanding, we have to actually be encountered by that which stands outside of it or that which exceeds it. And when that happens, you know that you've begun to find the edges of your human understanding and encounter the truly other at the moment of paradox, at the moment of offense, or at the moment of absurdity. That there's sort of this existential experience that signals that you've actually hit that limit. And if you don't experience absurdity or offense at all, then probably you haven't met that limit. Probably what you think you're discovering fits very comfortably internal to the confines of your human horizon, and you haven't been able to break out of that to encounter the truly other. And so for Abraham, it was this call from God to sacrifice his son, which is utterly absurd. It goes against, any kind of ethical system that we have, right? And there is obviously great offense to that. And this is why Silentio is so insistent that, look, if you try to make Abraham, through your interpretations, less offensive, you lose Abraham. Because precisely in that moment of offense, that you have the encounter with the living God, like with the truly other. And so the absurd is really, really important, not because faith by definition has to be irrational, but faith it's supra-rational, it's beyond that. And then ultimately, when God encounters us, there's the insertion of a possibility that did not exist prior, internal to our human world and our human understanding. So for the story of Abraham, the insertion of a new term, if you will, was the ram, God providing the ram. That Abraham is standing there facing a contradiction. Isaac dies because God has called me to sacrifice him. But according to God's promise, Isaac lives, and that's how salvation is going to come, and future generations are going to be blessed. And he's like, these are two contradictions that the human mind cannot mediate. Like, it breaks down at that point. I can't actually have it. Sublation doesn't work here. And so he stands like in that tension, in that paradox. And the way that it's quote unquote resolved is not by synthesis, but it's by God inserting a new term that then changes everything. And so that's the way that the absurd and that crucial moment, that experience of encountering the paradox, and then the new term being inserted. I think this is what Kierkegaard is really highlighting as this heightened moment of what faith is all about.
Oh, sorry, I interrupted you. I was just going to say thank you so much for that answer. That was really rich and robust. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and I don't think I answered your question about the night of faith and night of infinite resignation. Do you want me to give like a little explanation of that, or do you have another question?
Oh, no, that would be great. And then I'll give it over to Elisabeth right after that. But if you could just elaborate very, what they are actually from the text, if that's all right.
Yeah, absolutely. So Silentio gives a distinction. He kind of breaks faith, the movement of faith, down into two parts. The first part is resignation. And that is essentially where you surrender your dearest for the sake of the highest, as Meryl Westphal says. I think a great way to understand what this is in connection with Silentio actually references the hard sayings of Jesus. You have to, if you're going to follow me, you have to pick up your cross. You have to deny yourself. You have to hate your father and mother, like all these really problematic sayings in the Gospels that are like incredibly offensive to us, right? He thinks about Abraham very much in connection with those hard sayings. And so the night of infinite resignation is the night that says, what the world is telling me is the highest, is the most important, is the emblem of, spiritual maturity or just success or a happy life. And you lost that, your life would be a tragedy, you would be a failure, et cetera, et cetera. I think we can imagine what those might be culturally or even internal to religious culture. Putting those things, quote unquote, to death is a way of saying these are not actual ultimate. There's something that is more ultimate than this. And as long as I'm going around holding these things up as the ultimate, I'm stuck in a kind of idolatry. And so the Night of Resignation says that there is something higher than this. And so I'm going to relativize these things for the sake of the higher. And I'm going to actually resign. I'm actually going to give them up. I'm going to let the idol fall, if you will. And what I think is so amazingly profound about how Silentio tells this story is it's so honest to say that when we pick up our cross, whatever that might be, that feels a lot less like a nice experience of stepping into a church and a lot more gutting and devastating. And there's a confusion, the world around has no idea why you would do this. And you feel this kind of alienation from others, etc. And, but the Night of Infinite Resignation, or the first part of faith, this resignation, is to release that. But that is not faith in its entirety. That's the first step. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient for faith. And if you just stayed there, if you thought that faith was simply this great resignation, take the world but give me Jesus kind of thing, then you become this knight of infinite resignation. And he said that looks really pious. It might masquerade for faith, but it's not actual faith. True faith, at the same time, by the strength of the absurd, right? Releases the ultimacy of the things of the world, but then actually re-embraces them, but in a completely different mode, in a different way. So they're no longer ultimate, they're no longer idols, which allows me to re-embrace these things as gifts, as things that are contingent, as things that can be taken away, and that's okay. But yet things that are joyously given and that I can embrace and delight in. And so that's why Abraham walked up the mountain ready to sacrifice his son and everything that would come with that, and walked back down the mountain having re-embraced his son as a gift.
Thank you for that.
I love that. That's really wonderful. And it kind of leads into the next question I had, that kind of what happens to Abraham when he comes down. So it sounds like in order to be in sort of authentic or right relationship with the other, there are these moments of encounters that awakens the self or stirs the self. It's an impact. It initiates a transformation. There's sort of a becoming happening. And so I was wondering if you could just say a little bit more about, how you mentioned he's embracing his son again. He's still, even though it was a test, or, he didn't necessarily have to go through with this sort of tremendous sort of sacrifice and act. What does Kierkegaard leave for us when we come down from maybe our more transformative encounters with each other? How do we maintain sort of this relationship to the other in, I guess, okay, so let me see. What would it look like for the modern person in the more mundane aspects of our relations with self and other in daily life? Does Kierkegaard kind of give us any guidance for that, if that makes sense?
Yeah, well, I actually think that Fear and Trembling opens so nicely onto works of love as a text. So Fear and Trembling is almost like a precursor for then thinking about ethics and thinking, what does it mean to live a life of loving God and loving others? And so I think there is something that is radically transformative in the self and the self's relation to the other. I think that when you no longer are holding people up as idols, this is actually a very Dietrich Bonhoeffer approach to Kierkegaard. He actually has a lovely reading of Fear and Trembling, and I think he's absolutely right here, that when you are no longer holding things as ultimate, things like I need this thing or this person, let's say person, since we're talking about the other, they are my reason for being, my reason for living. If I don't have them, or if I lost them, then my life would be too much of a tragedy to keep going. And this idolatry kind of falls, then you're able to re-embrace them, not just like get rid of them, which I think was Kierkegaard's mistake with Regina Olsen, is he removed her, he resigned to her, he let the idol fall, if you will, but he did not re-embrace her in a different mode. It was just like moving the idol away from you, but that it's almost like an inversion is not a subversion. Just because you've like let go of the idol doesn't mean that it's no longer still that it's not still an idol for you, even though you've set it away. But something about re-embracing the other in a different mode, namely as gift, that is what leads you on to the ethical life of how do I treat the other? How do I welcome the presence of the other, not as a thing to be grasped or to hold on to for me, for myself, but as this neighbor that I have been given to love. And how do I have a kind of loving regard for the other and the other's existence, and recognize the singularity in the other, and the wonderful uniqueness of the other, and help to love forth that, help them become the best version, most mature expression of who they are. That's kind of the way that I then can live with the other if I'm no longer needing the other to somehow fulfill me. I'm actually to love the other in a much freer and even fuller way, if you will. And so I think in the case of Abraham and Isaac, he returns, and Silentio is talking about the joy that he has. Abraham returns with joy. And he thinks that if Abraham had not completely resigned to Isaac, and that moment of resignation was when he truly was like ready to go through with it. He was holding that knife up. Abraham did not get a glimpse at the ram in the bushes and be like, oh, I see how this is going to end. It'll be okay. I can go ahead and like perform this sacrifice because I know I'm not going to have to go through with it. He thinks if that had happened, then Abraham would not have truly resigned to Isaac. Isaac still would have been his idol, to use more of a Bonhoefferian way of thinking about this. But because he really truly resigned to Isaac, that he was able to re-embrace him with joy as a gift and hold him loosely, but yet embrace him joyously as a result.
I think that's really lovely. Because relationships, if we allow them to be, really powerful kind of experiences in our lives, it can be quite daunting, right? Because there's so many possibilities for the breaking down of the ego and self, and just kind of sometimes I think change in a relationship can be really scary, but those transformations or going through hard times with people and letting it change you, and always being willing to kind of sacrifice whatever it is that you need to lay down, in order to keep going deeper. I think that's really lovely. That's such a lovely point. So thank you for that. It's really clear.
And I think you're right to bring up the ego here, because I think that point of resignation is a decentering of the ego. It's recognizing that I don't have mastery or control over this thing. This is not this God that I need, that I have a kind of governance over. But it's a decentering of that, so that I can actually stand in this kind of loving and open relationship with this other person, and allow them in this kind of this commitment to the other for their best self. And so you're going to have changes in relationship. You're going to see changes in other people, and you're going to change as well. And love is this regard for the other in their singularity and who they are. So you're going to experience that all the time, but you can't actually experience that if you're holding on to them, if they're serving some kind of ultimate function for you. You have to make them be what you need them to be.
Right. And also if, we're kind of trying to reify ourselves and hold on to how we see ourselves and others see ourselves. And I think that can even be perhaps, kind of liberating direction for all of us. I think ever since the pandemic and maybe even before, all of the opportunities that we have to encounter each other on social media through, commenting on each other's posts and creating content, and just how we deal with each other. I think a lot of times on social media, if you're thinking if you think about reactions to what people put out there, how can we move toward a more, ethical collectivity? Because I think a lot of times, the ego tempts us to either defend ourselves or attack in some way. And sometimes that's our first step toward the other that is really very othered in our mind, because of the distance that the virtual world can kind of impose upon us. And so, so I don't know. I think maybe that can also be helpful for just, we have our relationships in real life, our lovers, our friends, our families, but then the people that we also engage with on the internet and the virtual world. I think that space also maybe needs kind of a restructuring and kind of reflection.
I 100% agree. I actually have a lot of interest in kind of digital spaces and how they're affecting us, but even just mapping the logic of fear and trembling onto the digital, particularly social media. I always wonder when people get so up in arms about things, or, they get so obsessed whatever, whether that's being argumentative or just being connected all the time, what have you. When you see kind of extreme relationships to social media in any form, you have to ask, what is this serving for you? What function is this, this world, this virtual world? Is it your ultimacy? If you didn't have success here in the social digital space, would that be some kind of life tragedy for you? Is it a kind of ultimacy for you? And what would it look like maybe to resign to it, to let it go, to let it die, to die to it? Not to then become a Luddite and remove yourself from all social media, but to embrace social media in a different way, as something that you have a much freer relationship to, because it doesn't have such control or be something that has so much at stake in your life.
Yeah, I love that. That's yeah. I was laughing because so many times that I think that's where I think myself and probably others tend to go when we get really tired or frustrated with trying to create something that we think will be life-giving, but then it doesn't feel like that always. It's kind of resigning ourselves to I don't know, some wooded area and never use technology again, right? But it's kind of how do we still go with the flow, but that kind of maybe we need moments of resignation to reflect on how we are manifesting ourselves in that space. I think that's helpful.
The wooded area, I think, is a great example. That would be being a knight of infinite resignation, right? That would be I'm just going to remove this from me because it's not good. That's just the first step. That's not the second step, which is to re-embrace it, but in a different mode, in a different way. And so I think especially our digital branding and the curated self, the digitally curated self, which is highly egocentric, and the self-commodification and the self-branding, et cetera, that's really giving ultimacy to the digital space, and also to myself, to kind of radically self-author and create the kind of self that I want, with my online presence that probably is not serving us very well at all.
Well, this has been an unbelievable discussion so far, and I'm really, really excited and happy that you brought up works of love, because that whole part about charity, and I use the Latin, and this idea of you shall love thy neighbor, like that whole idea of the golden rule, when you were expressing that, when you were talking about the other, was like perfect. It hit home, and I saw a connection between the two texts. But since we're almost getting time to, the show is almost over, I've already got a lot of DM messages for questions. So we're going to go to, if you don't mind, Amber, I know you have to get out of here right at 9. So we have questions from Ryan and from Apple. So I'm just going to hit invite to speak because he's messaged me for a question. And Ryan, you should be able to get the invite and ask your question to Dr. Bowen. Go ahead, Ryan.
Oh, good. I'm glad you can hear me. Yes. So I have 3 questions, and they may be a bit long considering that we only have about 15 minutes now. So I'll ask them in rapid succession, and then Amber can respond to whatever she wishes. So my first question is about the place of Kierkegaard after Hegel. So the sort of typical interpretation is that Kierkegaard is a radical critic of Hegel, and that he explodes the supposed sort of absolute objectification of reason in Hegel's logic and resituates it from the standpoint of the subject. Recent scholars like John Stewart have reinterpreted Kierkegaard as a kind of sub-Schillingian author that is radicalizing an element that's already implicit in Hegel, namely the moment of subjectivity, by which we reflect upon the logic and re-orchestrate and re-articulate those categories in our own daily lives. And so I would ask, for instance, is it possible to have a Kierkegaardian escape from Hegelian dialectic or from the system of Hegelian philosophy? Or is this always already within the standpoint of the subject that is already articulated by Hegel, and for which even the sort of explosive faith that cannot be dialectically sublated can be rethought from another perspective in a way that's commensurate with rational faith? The second question concerns the role of phenomenology. So you were describing how there's a proto-phenomenology in Kierkegaard, and I find this fascinating because, as you know, I presented previously about the proto-phenomenology in Plato, and also about its continuing relevance for reinterpreting Derrida in light of origin today. What I would ask is, if phenomenology involves transcendental deductions of the possibility of and the awareness of phenomenal experience, and even these transcendental deductions involve forms of logic that, if universal, are objective, then can we really have a form of phenomenology that is situated entirely from the subjective standpoint, that doesn't always involve an attempt to grasp that which is universal, and for that reason also that which is objective and can be shared between minds and apprehended amongst us all? And I suppose the last question is, what would you say would be the sort of continuing relevance of Kierkegaard today, after the movement of neo-Hegelianism that's variously been resurfaced after Charles Taylor, and continues today with the Pittsburgh Hegelians and with Stephen Holgate?
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Ryan, for those questions. I'm going to try to hit probably the first 2 just to save space for some other questions. But yeah, thank you for bringing up John Stewart and this question of Kierkegaard and Hegel. That's a big debate in the literature. I personally think that Kierkegaard is, maybe I probably stand somewhere in between the John Stewart and then some of the other, like Kierkegaard is radically anti-Hegelian, because obviously he's speaking in dialogue with Hegel. He's internal to that general network of thought, and there's so much that he has indebted to Hegel, and he definitely doesn't. He is working within so much of what Hegel has, right? And they both have this more phenomenological kind of approach. However, I do think that he is showing a detriment to Hegel's system in terms of it's being able to actually account for motion and movement. And so I think that he is showing that dialectic breaks down if it is truly this immanent kind of motion that you have to have in order for motion to happen. You have to have an insertion of a new term from the outside. And so I think he's working with Hegel. He's thinking about Hegel, but I would not actually say that there's like Kierkegaard that it kind of becomes sublated into Hegel. I think he's drawing what I consider to be pretty convincing critiques of the possibility of Hegel's dialect as an immanent motion. So I guess kind of a halfway way approach there to that question. The other question you had was about phenomenology and logic and the universal. And I think some of this just probably would take a longer conversation in terms of defining our terms, which is what philosophers just love to say. But when we're talking about doing phenomenological reductions and looking at the essence, right, of phenomenal experience, I think that's sometimes can be misunderstood when we say essence, to think essence in more of a classical sense, or to think in terms of universal concepts. But I think what phenomenology is doing when it comes to looking at essence is more of structural to experience as opposed to logical maxims or universal ideas. That's not really what phenomenology is actually investigating, and it's not really the point of the epoche to get to those things. It's more of looking at the conditions of possibility for certain experiences, and it's more of looking at structures of experience that are necessarily there. So anyway, I thank you so much for those questions. I hope that helped a little bit, and I'm sure we'll have more occasions to continue this conversation.
So Amber, I have a question from a friend named Kieran. She's having internet problems, but she's typed out her question, so I'll just read it for you. Mm-hmm. And then we can go to Mr. Fahrenheit afterwards. It says, how can you be a true individual if you're she's written multiple religions, Christian, Judaism, Sikhism, Hindu. Are there not rules that you are simply applying your life to and being a part of? So how is the role of individuality played in with the religious single individual, I guess, is her question.
Okay, so she's I think she's talking about religion in general, not necessarily specific religions. Or is she saying that there are specific religions that make it more challenging to think in terms of the single individual?
Yeah. So the individual that is a part of a religious faith, right. How are they truly a single individual by simply adhering to, let's say, the tenets, maxims, rules, and laws of the faith?
Yeah. Well, okay, I would say two ways. One is this idea of seeing oneself coram Deo, beneath the face of God. And I think maybe what she's getting at there potentially is, how are we actually anything isolated? We're so constituted by each other that how are we anything like specifically isolated? But I think Kierkegaard is going to want to say, like, no, we each do have a singularity. There is something unique about us. Like when God looks at us, he sees something, a particular someone, right? He sees Amber or he sees Chris. And God chose to make an Amber and a Chris. And so there is a way in which we can stand coram Deo, even as we're part of a religious faith tradition that's still very, very significant, and understanding ourselves not as having received this faith tradition as just something that I kind of mindlessly receive, but as something that is significant for me, even in those practices, to be able to come to that point of that finding myself beneath the face of God, first and foremost. So, for example, on the occasion of a confession, like that's a religious practice. And it's in that practice that I actually am able to enter into that experience of seeing myself before the face of God. But the other thing is that when it comes to also taking up these religious practices, which can be very ritualistic, which can be very similar regardless of who you are, right? You're joining in on a practice that's much bigger than you, in a community that's bigger than you. There's a lot that Kierkegaard talks about with imitation, particularly for self-examination. That, what does it mean to imitate Christ, or what does it mean for me to take part in and participate in a religious community? There is a way in which, when I don't know, something stupid, like when I ride my bike, I ride it in a way that only I will, right? Like there's bike riding, and that's pretty standard across the board, but I bring my subjective self to it. And so if we don't imitate Christ through aping, through mindless, mimicking, right? Imitation of Christ actually means understanding how the pattern of Christ's life, how I can indwell that pattern. So I think it's like a subjective indwelling of these bigger forms and patterns and practices that are done across time and space in this community of faith of which I'm a part.
Thank you for that. And we have Mr. Fahrenheit who has a question now. So Mr. Fahrenheit, if you just unmute yourself, you can ask your question or pose your thought to Dr. Bowen.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. This is less a question and more comments, but I'd love to hear what you think. It's a kind of interpretation. And something that resonated with me deeply about Kierkegaard's Knight of Faith is that they ask for a place of pure freedom. The Knight of Faith has absolutely no reason to believe, yet he or she does. There is no logic, rationality, or ethics to ground the act, and in that way take the freedom away from the will of the subject. But it is an act that arises purely from the will of the subject, and in that way is truly free, unlike the Knight of Resignation, whose act remains within the ethical, so in that way is not truly free. So I interpret the Knight of Faith as a true free individual, and it made me reconsider how I understood freedom previously.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think it would be fun to think about this question of freedom and the will when it comes to this particular sort of two-step process of faith, because obviously there's going to be, resignation, that is going to be a decision of the will. Like that's going to have to be a free act of the will. A lot of agency goes into that. One question that I would have is, well, of course, this goes back to, the questions about the nature of freedom, right? But if you're in that experience, I think about Job in the whirlwind, or Abraham on the mountain, or, Climacus talking about the paradox, is embracing faith in that second movement, is it this radical freedom, or is it a response to a call that is given? This is not to say that it's not free, but if you're encountering the paradox, you've encountered something that's bigger than you, something that you can't fully contain, and you're kind of overwhelmed by it, and you choose to give yourself to it. Like, that is an act of freedom, but it's not this kind of autonomous radical freedom either, because it's always responsive to something that has come before, that has encountered you. And there's a sense in which you don't even fully understand what you're giving yourself to, right? Because it's so much bigger than you. And so I think it goes back down to these questions of, like, how do we define freedom and understand what it is? But I think that there's a sense that, I mean, if you put it in terms of a romantic relationship, for example, you meet a significant other, and this person kind of knocks you off your feet, and you're like, I can do no other but pursue this, right? Like, is that a radically free choice? I feel quite constrained. I feel quite compelled. I can't do any other, but yet I feel like my agency is completely alive in that experience as well. So, thank you for that comment. It's fun to think about these things, and I'm going to continue thinking about that.
Thank you so much. Great responses, Dr. Bowen. I love how you just kind of embrace everyone's question, and like you have so much to kind of add to it. So I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who is here and asked a question and just listened. And I know I was so inspired by this. And thank you so much, Dr. Bowen, for giving us your time and your wonderful, positive, inspiring spirit. Just before we go, I guess I have two kind of final questions. If someone maybe hasn't even read Fear and Trembling, but they want to kind of encounter Kierkegaard, what might be a good sort of first book, like a first primary text that you would recommend? And then I guess my second question is, can we read your dissertation? Are you working on a book? Where can we continue to read your thoughts?
First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to be here and be part of this conversation and be part of the community, actually. It's super exciting. So as far as a good primary text, Fear and Trembling is wonderful. It's also very, very confusing and difficult. So I recommend going in with a good secondary text to help with that. Claire Carlisle has a really wonderful reader on Fear and Trembling, and also John Lippett does as well. So there's lots of help out there. But, some of it depends on what you're interested in, if you're more theologically interested or philosophically interested. But a great place to start is Kierkegaard's Upbuilding Discourses. Those are not pseudonymous. It's written by himself, his name, or he signs it. It's his signed authorship. But the Upbuilding Discourses are just lovely, and they're more, I would say, this kind of spiritually edifying discourses. So I would recommend that. And then as far as my dissertation goes, I know my dissertation is cataloged, so you should be able to find it online. At the moment, I'm working on a different book project that is it's part of a grant project it's a Templeton grant through the University of St. Andrews for the Widening Horizons in Philosophical Theology project. And I'm working on a monograph in consultation with Merold Westphal, who wrote a book called Suspicion and Faith, The Religious Uses of Modern Atheism, with Fordham University Press back in '98. And I'm writing sort of a continuation of this to think about, so Merold argues that Christians should read Freud, Nietzsche, and Marx for Lent as a Lenten practice. That their critique of religion can actually make way for better religion is his big argument. And I'm arguing that after having read Freud, Nietzsche, and Marx for Lent, that Christians should then read Kierkegaard for Epiphany. And so I'm trying to construct a hermeneutics of edification internal to which I situate suspicion, but kind of think beyond it as well. And so that's what I'm working on at the moment. So most of my kind of things that are coming out this year have to do with that. But I'm looking forward to having that project hopefully finished in the next year or two. And but that's primarily what I'm working on right now.
Well, we are both so thankful for having you here in this space and for answering our questions. We know you have to get going. You have an early morning tomorrow. So thank you for coming here and for answering our questions and for having this discussion with us. Because both Elisabeth and I, we don't like the whole podcast structure. We prefer an open discussion, like a cue to the old ancient Greek societies where they had, the discussion from the chorus, people watching from the ancient theaters. So we like this idea. So thank you.
It's fabulous.
Great. Well, thank you so much for coming and just for being fantastic. You're awesome. And I really, really, really am so happy that you came here. And so this will be recorded. It'll be up on our Twitter, on my Twitter space. And then I think Elisabeth will upload it on our YouTube channel for archiving. Is that right, Elisabeth?
Yes, absolutely. It should be up tomorrow. So if you didn't get to ask your question or give your thoughts, We always do a premiere. It'll be up around 5:30 tomorrow, Mountain Time. And so feel free to join in on the live chat.
Yes, so I guess this is us signing off. And Amber, once again, thank you so much. And yes, so take care, everyone. And we'll see you again next weekend for another Philosophy in the Spotlight.
Yes, thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.